So can I officially welcome you to this EMCC Global GPS Dialogue? Really pleased to have Stephen with us here today. Stephen is Senior Practitioner with EMCC Global and Head of Coaching at BPP University. He works in the further and higher education sector and he has leadership experience related to initial teacher training and continued professional development and also widening participation. And I'm really pleased to introduce you to him and for him to introduce his title of the session today, which is Threshold Concept in Coaching. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you straight over to Stephen.
Oh, thank you, Nicola. And yeah, welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I won't say good morning nor afternoon. I'd say welcome because I obviously appreciate people are joining from different parts of the globe. But many thanks for being here today. I'm just going to share my screen so that we can make sure that we're all able to see what's intended. Perfect. So threshold concepts in coaching, just before we sort of think about, well, what does that mean? What might that look like today? Just to give a little bit of a background to myself. So I have about 25 years of experience of working in the further and higher education sector, as Nicola said, in teacher education, professional development, and also then in coaching, a professional coach, senior practitioner with EMCC Global. But what I also have is, and I'll let you into a bit of a secret, it's approaching 50 years of experience of just being a learner as well, you know, and that's continuing, that's not stopping, both in a formal sense and an informal sense. So my role here at BPP University is head of coaching, and we deliver the higher level apprenticeship in coaching professional. That's a relatively new program that is government led, and we roll out as part of our curriculum. And that is an apprenticeship scheme that welcomes over 1,000 students currently onto the 12-month program, which is level 5. So just for purposes of everyone's benefit, level 5 being sort of the midway point in an undergraduate degree. And really what I really want to bring here today is what I think is the start of a discussion where we bring together threshold concepts in coaching. Now, I'm happy to be corrected, but very much I feel that there's very little in the sector around the relationship between threshold concepts, which we'll talk about, and coaching as we know it. So that's really what I hope to do, is that by the end of this session, we've considered threshold concepts. We've looked at reflection as a proposed threshold concept in coaching, and we arrive at a point where we can actually determine whether or not we feel there's more that can be said about this. There's more we can do. There's more we can talk about. There's more that we can research in this area. I don't come as the expert, but very much what I'm coming at is sort of in the spirit of what I understand GPS to be about, is around dialogue and around co-creation. So in terms of what we're hoping to do today, and I'm just going to place those aims of the session up there for you to have a read through. I'm not going to read through them sort of word by word, but essentially we want to cover things related to threshold concepts. What are they? We also then want to think about, well, what are your experiences of threshold concepts, both in terms of your general schooling and also coach education? What's your coach education, and what threshold concepts might have existed or continue to exist in terms of your coach education? And then we really want to think about reflective practice as a threshold concept, proposing it, not to actually presenting it as a defined threshold concept, but saying, is it a threshold concept? Do we think it has merit in being classed as one? Now, I also have the experience of getting stuck myself as a learner, an experience of seeing my learners get stuck. And when I first came across threshold concepts, it really made me to start thinking around, okay, this is what I've been experiencing, both as a learner and also as a tutor, this idea of being stuck and thinking about, where do we get stuck and how do we become unstuck? So what I'd like you to do, and feel free to pop your thoughts into the chat, is to really think, what is the link here on this slide? Any thoughts emerging? What's the link? What's the common link? Just pop your thoughts in the chat. Yeah, so somebody just popping in their thoughts there. Yeah. And we're getting a consensus. We're getting a consensus that colourful. Thanks very much, Natalie. We're getting this consensus of 3. And what we might not be able to do is take ourselves right back to being a toddler and thinking about the challenge of understanding that that symbol, the purple symbol on the left-hand side, represents the value of 3. And that 3 can be represented in different ways. We can have 3 apples, all of the same color, the shape, the size, and they are 3. But we could also have 3 C objects. It's still 3. The value is still 3. And we can write 3, and the written form of 3 is the same value as a numerical form of 3. But as a toddler, that can be a really challenging and troublesome time for them to think about, well, how does that all make sense? But if we try and think back to how troublesome that was for us as a toddler, we might find that really challenging to go way back and think, well, how did it feel like to have that as a challenge? But coming through that challenge and understanding that that is the value of 3 in whatever form it's represented enables us to move on. It enables to move on and actually take on other challenges like counting or subtraction or multiplication or division or percentages, whatever that might be. It enables us to move on. It enables us to make links in learning as well to other concepts. But it will also be irreversible. We can't forget that that means 3. So what I want to do now is I want you to imagine that we've got 2 cups of tea. Now, the cups of tea are in the same type of mug. They've got the same amount of water. The only difference is that we add a measure of milk to cup A. Okay, so imagine we've got 2 cups of tea stood side by side. We've got the same amount of water in them. One has a measure of milk. Now, we're wanting them to cool down. So cup A has got this milk, cup B has got no milk in it. And we wait 3 minutes and we add milk to cup B, just like we did to cup A 3 minutes earlier. Which of the 2 cups of tea is now cooler? Cup A, which had the milk at the start, or cup B, which had the milk added to it 3 minutes later? Let us know your thoughts. Cup A or cup B? Which is cooler?
I think we're there. I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
All right. So 61% say B and 39% say A. Okay. Thanks for that, Nicola. So the answer is the second cup, which actually, 61% of us got correct there. Because in the initial stages of cooling, it is hotter than the first cup with the milk in it, i.e. cup A, and it therefore loses more heat because of the steeper temperature gradient. Now, when I first saw this, I just felt that that was counterintuitive. I personally would have gone A, because I just didn't get it. I just didn't get the idea that something which had milk in for longer, which was cooler, wouldn't then bring down the temperature quicker. And I don't get that still. I don't profess to be somebody who understands heat transfer or temperature gradients. So to me, it's counterintuitive. And this could be seen as a threshold concept, the understanding of heat transfer and temperature gradients. And if we think about this with chefs, when this is applied to a kitchen environment, understanding this concept enables a chef to think differently. And it's really this key thing about thinking differently about their work and how they cook their food. And the threshold concept in this example can be classed as controlling heat transfer. So what I wanted to do was just provide, before we start to think about, well, what is this thing we call, how do we classify a threshold concept, is to think about something that we will have all have experienced very early on in our lives, and something that could actually be quite alien to us. And certainly in my case, and I'll hold up my hand, very much counterintuitive. And that's maybe something to do with the fact of my standard of cooking. Who knows? So a threshold concept. I'm going to give you a moment just to read the quote that was offered by the key authors and the founders of threshold concepts, Mayer and Land, in 2003. So Mayer and Land really developed threshold concepts from a UK national research project into the possible characteristics of strong teaching and learning environments. And really what they were looking at doing was finding out what were the challenging concepts in their curriculum. And they considered threshold concepts as a portal, akin to a portal. And by traveling through a threshold concepts and developing an understanding of these hard to reach concepts, opened up a previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. And it can provide and represent a transformed way of understanding, or how we interpret or how we view something. And if we're unable to move across that threshold, then the chances are it could actually inhibit our progress as learners. And this, as I say, was developed by Mayer and Land in 2003. And some of the key terms or phrases that are associated with threshold concept include counterintuitive. And I explained to you this idea of heat transfer being counterintuitive to me. The idea of liminality, in that we are between two places. The idea of getting it, and Ray Land and Mayer talk very much about threshold concepts is about people getting the concept. And quite often what they find is that not everyone gets it. And how do we support people in getting these hard to reach concepts? But what Mayer and Land talk about is that what it enables us to do is to strike a difference between simply studying something and thinking like something. So for instance, they use the idea of somebody might study history. Others might learn to think like a historian. And I suppose we can then start to think, well, what links does this have to coaching in terms of studying coaching or practicing coaching, and then starting to think like a coach? And they also draw the links through to the opportunity for an ontological shift, this idea of existence, about who we are as a being. So these are some of the sort of phrases or the terminology that is associated with threshold concepts. Now, if we look at some of the key characteristics of threshold concepts, and this is something we will be really thinking about in the first breakout, is the four key characteristics are that, first of all, they are transformative, that it will transform the way that we think about something. It will transform our view of a discipline, provide us with a new lens for thinking and or being. That it will be irreversible, similar to the number 3 and understanding numbers as values. Threshold concepts are also likely to be irreversible. We don't forget that the apple will fall from the tree as a result of gravity. We don't forget that. But they also talk about the idea that threshold concepts will be troublesome. And this links to the work of somebody called Perkins, who suggested that knowledge can be troublesome when it is certainly counterintuitive, alien, or seemingly incoherent. And when we're in this liminal space of not being at a point of mastery, but somewhere in between being novice and mastery, is this idea that some concepts can be troublesome to us. But also a characteristic, is that it's integrative. And that once they're learned, they are likely to bring together different aspects of a subject that didn't previously appear to be related to that individual. So they can actually work across knowledge systems, if you like, or the boundaries of those systems. So these are our 4 key characteristics of threshold concepts we want to really think about today: transformative, irreversible, troublesome, and integrative. Now, some of the examples of threshold concepts across other subject areas, and again, I'm not going to profess to be an expert in economics or physics, etc., or English literature, but they identify certain concepts, and you might relate to some of these. These might be part of your current profession or previous experience. But in economics, they talk about opportunity cost as a threshold concept where students are likely to get stuck, or most likely. In physics, the idea of gravity or heat transfer, as we've suggested. In biology, they talk about variation as a threshold concept. And English literature, things like text or meaning or form and content. And I hope what this is doing is starting to make you think about what have been threshold concepts in my schooling or my previous experience, or perhaps in my coach education. Things that maybe have been troublesome, they might have been transformative, they might be integrative. And just to share a couple of my experiences in terms of coaching. So when I first came into coaching, I was introduced to the concept of use of self. And that for me, and I'll share my vulnerabilities, I suppose, is to say that, I found this idea of use of self. Well, what do we mean by that? How will I know I'm using myself well? What will that look like? What will that feel like? The idea of reality, of saying, somebody's challenging me and say, well, what is reality? For me was a threshold concept, something I had to work through, something that was troublesome for me. And then also one example, the idea of transference and countertransference. And for me, again, that was something of challenge for me. That was something that I would now look back on as a threshold concept, where I was in a liminal place. And it was through my work and my practice and my reflections that I was able to be supported in terms of moving across that threshold to a point where it will be irreversible for me. And it is supporting me as that whole self, that ontological shift about who am I as an individual. So I hope that what this is doing is stimulating some sort of thought in terms of what are your experiences of threshold concepts? Can you recall any threshold concepts as part of your school or your coach education that might continue today? And to what extent do your experiences align with the 4 characteristics of threshold concepts, not the 5, so apologies. So to what extent do your experiences align with the 4 characteristics of threshold concepts, in that they are transformative, irreversible, troublesome, and integrative? So Nicola, I think we're at a point there, after sort of introduction of what is a threshold concept, some examples, about giving people the opportunity to just talk about their experiences. And I think this is going to really be very supportive in terms of starting to bring practitioner thoughts and experiences into the chat after we come back.
That's super. Thank you for that, Stephen. I've put a link in the chat as well to where I've screenshotted that and popped it on a Google Doc. Oh, I can see lots of people in there already. So brilliant. Good that you found that link. So we're going out for 15 minutes. You'll get a little ping after 13. We'll bring you back automatically in 15. And we'll see you in 15.
Oh, thanks, Nicola. Great. So really interested to see via the chat to start with, what came up for people, and in terms of threshold concepts they might look back on from a previous sort of education, or perhaps specific to coaching or supervision or mentoring. What are the sort of threshold concepts that people have experienced, and maybe how did they link to being troublesome or transformative, irreversible, or integrative in any way? So any comments you've got in the chat. But just while we're doing that, there was a couple of thoughts that came up in there Yeah, no, absolutely, Louise. It's not something that we sort of, I'm sure Mayer and Land wouldn't want us to easily sort of confine our understanding of threshold concepts and our interpretation within a 75-minute period. So no, absolutely get that. It was really more anything that's really started to bubble up, or thoughts we have on this topic. But a couple of thoughts that were shared earlier in the chat before we went away. One by Georgia, just sort of asking about vertical development. So Georgia, would you like to share, what your thoughts are on that? What made you think about that as a possible link?
Sure. I think it has to do with how the capacity of one's person sort of can expand. In other words, in our daily development, what we call horizontal development, we learn, we get new knowledge, we learn new models, new techniques. All that, it's important. But what the vertical development does is helping us, maybe through reflection, maybe through working in support groups, like group supervision or team supervision, where we go through a process where we test our experiences. We get into difficult situations where we need to reevaluate and reassess things. And I think that's important for a coach. The combination of horizontal and vertical are important. The easiest part, I think, it probably is the horizontal, which is, we go in classroom training, we learn new techniques, we learn new things. But the other part is what makes us sort of improve our learning capacity, it's a matter of growth as a person, growth as a professional, which is different from knowledge taking.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, no, thank you for that. And certainly when you referred to vertical, I immediately and then thought about the horizontal as well, in terms of, when I first saw that, I thought, well, I wonder if the horizontal is this state of liminality that we talk about being in this liminal space of not knowing everything, and is that the horizontal, and is the threshold the point at which there is an inflection that we start to then work vertically? That's just what came to mind when you were talking there. I think what also came to mind there was really around, I suppose, how this links to the work of supervision, and that when we talk about threshold concepts, it's quite hard as somebody who has traveled across a threshold to always go back and think what it felt like to be in that liminal space, and what work can we do there to think about where the other person is, given that we've journeyed across that bridge on that threshold, but like the three, we don't remember what it felt like to not know what three really meant. So that was only the other thing that came up when you were talking there. So thank you. I don't know if there's anything else that sort of resonates there from what I've said.
I like you mentioned it in the beginning as well, the fact that once we move on, either because of a supervision or because of some deep reflection, you don't go back. You're already a step ahead. So that's the difference, I think. That's how you add value. You move a step forward in your development.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to come in on just the thought about where we've got to in terms of vertical and horizontal development? Anybody else? No. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Georgia. Really helpful. Andrew Leahy, you mentioned about insight. Anything more to say on that? I see your.
I've been thinking a lot recently about the coaching therapy boundaries for all sorts of reasons, and what you're talking about earlier just wonder, well, isn't that what people say as insight in other areas? Say, the development of the understanding of new concepts. So we acquire knowledge about something, but you're making a point, I think, that acquiring knowledge is not the same as necessarily as it may be a necessary precursor to understanding, but it's not the same. So I might have done the work to understand, I might have the knowledge of how to be a coach, but I don't necessarily have the concept of coaching.
Okay.
So the struggle for me being not to offer solutions.
Okay. Well, I suppose when I first saw the word insight, I thought, okay, so what do we do with that insight? You know, what do we do with it to support our development? And then I think what else came up for me was the fact of going back to what Mayer and Land talk about the difference between being a trained coach and thinking like a coach. And what is the difference? What is the difference here? How do we know there's a difference? What does it feel like? What does it look like? This difference between having a certificate to say we are a coach or an accreditation to say we are a coach, but then thinking like a coach. So I suppose that's the link, I suppose, I make back to threshold concepts and what Mayer and Land say about the characteristics.
But Steve, would it not depend on the context we hold as a coach that we're trained in, how we'll think as a coach? You know, if I think about different modalities of coaching in the same way as there's different modalities of psychotherapy, I think the bit that was missing earlier on in the coaching profession was a context, an overall context for the work. There were all the skills that were learned, but what was it that held the coach themselves in their thinking?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Anne, I don't come from a modality-specific sort of position, and I think it's really down to who they are as a coach, and you know their existence, if you like, that ontological sort of aspect of it, of who they are and what they're trying to do, what good work they're trying to do. So I'm certainly not coming at it from a modality-specific position. But I'm interested to know more about what you think about what's missing.
What I would think was what's missing. Well, I suppose it was the bit that Andrew was just saying about, I actually feel now that all coaches need to have some sort of psychological understanding of the human being, because especially since lockdown and COVID, people aren't just looking about getting promotion and getting further in their careers. They're looking at, why am I here? What's my life about? So, you know, being able to think more deeply and being trained to be able to look at those questions for ourselves feels important to me. That feels something that was missing.
Okay.
But I think we're moving more and more in coach trainings now towards making sure people are equipped to be able to sit with the client and think about these existential issues that they may be facing.
No, thank you for that, Anne. That's really helpful. And I suppose if I come at this from a curriculum design perspective, which is where threshold concepts really originated, is then we start to think, well, what does our curriculum look like? And lots of curriculum, irrespective of sectors and subjects and levels, they very much talk about being stuffed. We have overloaded curriculums where it's just stuffed full of content. But what are the jewels in the curriculum? What are the jewels? What are the key concepts that we really need to focus on in order to help people have those transformative shifts? And I think that's what I sense that's what you're referring to in terms of, you know, real focus on the jewels in the curriculum, if you like, whatever they might be. Whether they be about relationships, as Agnieszka, I think, is suggesting there, or other concepts. And I suppose this sort of could take us on to this idea of me sort of positioning reflective practice as a threshold concept, and how it's worthy of, I suppose, more airtime in our curriculum or our development as coaches. Have I summarized that in the way that you would hope, Anne?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Anne. Anything else sort of coming up in the chat? Nicola, anything you've noticed that I've sort of missed just while we've been speaking there?
Yeah, there's a couple of comments actually. I think David has made it more recently around the threshold that we're facing globally as well. Cost of living, world events, moving from what we know and understand now to a potentially unknown threshold going forward as well.
Yeah, and I think somebody did actually talk about this idea of not knowing as a threshold concept and feeling sort of comfortable in this emergent. Well, I wonder, when I sort of read the two, I wondered if there was a link there actually, that it's this sort of threshold of not knowing. But I'll allow David to say more about whether or not there is something in that.
Well, I think Anne built on my comments, and I agree. I agree. It just, because when you're talking about threshold comments, and I was sort of pondering the issue which I felt had been sort of threshold learning, and I just thought, certainly in the UK, and I think in other parts of the world, but perhaps especially in the UK, we are going into a period of time that is going to be extraordinarily difficult and which we're not very well prepared for. And we have the sort of global climate crisis, and we have an energy crisis, because energy prices are quadrupling, and that's going to affect the economy. And the politicians don't seem to link the two, which seems absolutely crazy. So it just feels to me like we as a country, maybe as a world, we're going to need to think a lot more quickly and a lot more smartly, and maybe there are going to need to be some threshold learning to actually get through this time without too many people being damaged. So that's a bit downbeat, but I guess going into the autumn, looking at the news, that's a bit difficult not to be, really.
Yeah, and I wonder, David, if it sort of leads into what we're going to now talk about reflective practice, and certainly when I think about that and the importance of it, is the fact that we're not just technicians, are we, who are techno-rational, who just follow a process and what have you. I think it was Sean who said about the swampy marshlands, that there are other concepts to consider here, that are very much human and behavioral and what have you. And I wonder if that actually links in with this concept of reflective practice, and where does it sit? Is it a threshold concept that's worth considering more? Is that okay to work on that basis, David?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. So are we okay, Nicola, to move on? We're sort of into that.
Sorry, can I just add one other thing?
Of course.
Which another link, I think, a few years ago, I was vice president responsible for standards and accreditation in EMCC, and a lot of that was about trying to decide how you decide what courses get the European Quality Award. And so that's a very difficult discussion, because different people think different people are important to the coaching, and there isn't a sort of worldwide agreed curriculum, if you like. And so this whole question is vital in that. And one of the positions that EMCC took, which I think was different to some of the other coaching associations, was that EMCC took the view that reflective practice was key, and that's not the case for all the other associations.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's really helpful, and I think leads us in really nicely to this idea of reflective practice and whether or not, is it a threshold concept? Just to provide you with a little bit of our context. So at BPP, we committed, obviously, to the quality of coaching, ethically, and in terms of for a competency base as well. Making sure that we have great coaches coming out of our program. We obviously review the curriculum. It's coming up for 2 years old, and we wanted to undertake its first full review, and we wanted to consider, as Cousin describes, those jewels of the curriculum, and we very much have picked out reflective practice as one of those. we don't want to make the assumption that people are well versed with reflection. People are coming from different backgrounds. We have an average age of sort of 38, I think it is, on the program. They are dual professionals. We aren't making the assumption that they are, like I say, they've had an experience of reflective practice, having maybe being a nurse or a teacher. They're coming from different backgrounds. But also this idea as student as consumer. They are all working. They are all professionals. Sometimes they haven't got time to get stuck. They don't want to get stuck. They just want to pass the program. So here we have this sort of this challenge between a provider and ourselves wanting to really reinforce the space and the time to think about a concept that is so crucial, like reflective practice. But some people maybe just say, just tell me what I need to do. Tell me what I need to write to demonstrate that I'm being reflective. So just to give you a little bit of context about where we're working at BPP and what we're trying to do. So what are the other professions saying? Well, sports coaching for years has been sort of very much sort of thinking about reflective practice, and the work of Trelfer. Joe Trelfer is really quite sort of prominent, and talk about the confusion of graduates getting it, interviewees questioning the purpose of reflective practice and whether they're doing it properly. They're really not sure. This idea that of the challenge between reflection for learning purposes versus reflection for assessment purposes, and who is the reflection for? Quite often it's for the purposes of academic tariff, to pass an assessment or to pass an accreditation, as opposed to solely being for them and their learning and their development, so that reflection can be truly for intrinsic worth, for intrinsic value, significance. So what I'm now starting to think about, is reflective practice a threshold, or is it the environment within which reflective practice is taking place? So what I'm doing here is just giving you some quotes, some research from other areas to, I suppose, support Breakout 2 that is coming up. We continue with sports coaching, Trelfer again, but now Telfer. In fact, a former university professor of mine, going right back to the mid-90s, Hamish Telfer, and they talk about the individual speaking about having a profound learning experience from reflection, but the task of writing it down to fit, and that fit being really key, what is required or perceived as being required, is an ordeal that effectively puts a handbrake on the reflective process, sometimes actually meaning that emotions and beliefs don't actually find their way through in the true spirit of what is actually truly being reflected. So first of all, they're talking about the confusion in getting it, and the fact that interviewees from research were questioning the purpose. Then this idea about the difference between reflection for learning versus reflection for assessment, and what was the purpose, what was the end goal of the reflection. Then obviously then thinking about them when they start to come to have to write it down, perceiving that that's what they need to do, or that's what they've been asked to do, is that it puts some form of brake on the reflective process. So me questioning, is reflective practice a threshold concept, or is it the environment in which we actually initiate it through coach education and who knows, accreditation? Then we talk about the myths and misunderstandings in education, that some people will take it too literally. They will see it as pausing for thought or navel gazing, as opposed to maybe a deeper level of what reflection might look like. Again, what we're seeing here is misunderstandings or myths or misconceptions about what is it actually that reflective practice is. Here's one from management. They've actually done work in management, in postgraduate management, to actually say, yes, the concept of threshold is highly relevant to reflective practice. And they bring in this idea of that behavioral aspect, something we touched on very briefly already in our discussions, that this isn't just merely us becoming technicians and we follow a rigid process every time that we engage in reflective practice. And just before we move to the breakout, just two more. One from biology and work-based learning in biology. they start to actually differentiate between reflection and reflexivity, not seeing them as two of the same. Of actually, well, what is the difference? And is actually possible that reflection is a threshold concept, but when we talk about its integrative characteristics, is that in order to enable somebody to then move on to understanding reflexivity then? And is there a sequence of order that needs to be followed here? And do we talk enough about the difference between reflection and reflexivity, or do we just bound it as one thing? I wonder if that is actually leading to the possibility, again, it's all possibilities of this as a threshold concept. And then finally, one from EMCC UK from 2015, that within the sector, there's this agreement that it's a good thing, but agreement that what is actually reflective practice? And from an assessor's perspective, that talking about the weaknesses, and the weaknesses in this case being about people having action from their reflection, but no real sort of evidence of insight as described earlier, or awareness that's actually fueling the action. So what I've wanted to do there is just share with you some potted sort of overviews of what other people are talking about reflective practice, and how we can take some of the characteristics or the terminology or the phrases that we've talked about earlier and think about there might be something here that we need to do. Again, I didn't arrive here as saying it's all done and dusted and here's the research, but what is it that we might need to do here? So if we think about breakout 2, and I'll be guided by Nicola whether or not we might need to look at 10 minutes for this one. But Nicola, you let me know, is to think about your own reflective practice over time as well. Think about, when you were first introduced to reflective practice, where are you now? What's the journey been like? But to what extent has it been transformative? Is it irreversible? Has it been troublesome? And to what extent might it be integrative, enabling you to actually make links across other concepts as well? Again, a challenge I know in 10 minutes, but even if we can get the bubbling of some thoughts and experiences, that could be hugely helpful, I hope. So, Nicola, thoughts on timings?
I'm going to do 10 minutes.
Okay, great.
It's back at about 10 past, or about 11 past. We've got networking afterwards as well, so we can continue the conversation there too, but within this session we sort of wrap up so that everybody's got time expectations. But I'm going to open them now, and
okay.
I'll see you in minutes.
Thanks, Nicola.
Oh yes, you're all back automatically. Brilliant. Everybody's back. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for engaging in that breakout. So we're really looking at reflective, your own reflective experiences. So feel free to pop in the chat, anything that really came to mind for you in terms of your own experience of a reflective practice, linked to those 4 characteristics that we've been talking about. Alternatively, anybody who'd like to sort of just come on screen and just share any of their experiences, then just let me know. Now, we do want to just sort of recontract for an extra sort of 5 minutes, if that is possible. We've just been running slightly behind time. So just really to spend the next sort of 3 to 4 minutes really reviewing what we've just been talking about in the breakouts, and then really just sharing with you finally a little bit about what we're doing here to try and support people with reflection. So just to let people be aware of that, but we have got a networking opportunity straight after. So anybody, reflections on reflection?
Can I come in here?
Of course.
Something that came up in a way we went probably a bit further than the brief in our cohort, which was generated by comments that Andrew made, and they might want to come in and say more about that, and Anne talk more about it. We ended up with talking about ethics of reflective practice and politics of reflective practice, and the whole thing about reflective practice being a doing thing, so it becomes mechanical, i.e. for assessment purposes, if you like, which is what you were talking about.
Yes.
Are sort of an embodiment of reflective practice, because the being of reflective practice. And that whole debate, we weren't able to expand anymore, but I think that was a useful point to get to. I don't know whether Anne or Andrew want to say more.
I think what Andrew brought in at the end, and sorry to name you, Andrew, but I think it was really useful, was pointing out that can the person who is asking for to observe the reflective practice, can they bear to hear the truth? Because I think that if they haven't done the work on themselves, they may have judgment around the individual being really open and honest in their reflective practice. And that individual needs to be supported and trusted and, you know, the material built on rather than be silenced.
Yeah. Andrew, did you want to, thank you, and Andrew, did you want to take up the offer of adding anything before I come in?
No, I think it's something I need to think through a bit more. I just think it's when we are trying to do this, when we are trying to do this in a way because people have to do it for their CPD or whatever, and people have to do it for their academic courses.
Yeah.
How much does that depend on the person who's assessing them, what they accept as reflection, what they don't, and how much it's a tricky one. Anyway, yeah. I'll shut up.
No, thank you for that. It is tricky, and obviously when we see that you know, the definitions of what good reflective practice looks like are inconsistent, then obviously there's a challenge there straight away. In the sports coaching field, again, they've talked about this inherent contradiction between openness and honesty on the one hand, and the possibility of our self-disclosure being wrong, at fault, or contradicting others on the other hand. You know, the tendency therefore is to say what needs to be said as opposed to what should or could be said. The assessment of someone else's moral or ethical dilemma is in itself an ethical issue. So it feels like, you know, this is where we're arriving at is, okay, so whose reflection is this anyway? And what's the purpose of this? And this is where I'm stuck, and really going back right to the start of, is reflective practice a threshold concept, or is it the environment in which we make it troublesome? Are we making it troublesome? And is it okay? It's just that the environment's not allowing it to sort of be what it needs to be. And this is where we started this conversation in a sense. I don't know, but it feels okay not to know, but it feels okay to say, is this worthy of a discussion? And so thank you for bringing that, Jaffa, up in terms of that ethics. I think it's a hugely important point. But what I would really encourage you to do is pop any thoughts you do have in the chat. But I really hope that this can be the start of a discussion. I would really like to be part of a group that sort of, or a community that really starts to think about, well, you know, what sense can we make of this, whether it be threshold concepts in coaching and supervision mentoring, or reflective practice and its links to threshold concepts. I'm okay with not knowing where it will take us and being very much taking it from a grounded approach. That's okay to me. And while we'll use the history and the reflections and the theories from other sectors, we can actually build our own, and that's okay too. So what I would like to do is just before we finish is, and I will now, as a result of it going wrong last time, can I just check that everyone can see my slides?
Yes, that's good.
Great. So what are we doing as part of our curriculum development? We're very much talking about what reflection is with our learners right from the start. We're not making those assumptions that they're all coming with the same understanding. We're very much taking a recursive approach to our engagement. It doesn't just happen at the start of the program and it's a case of, right, now get on with it. It's recursive. It's a spiral curriculum where we are constantly revisiting this concept of reflective practice. The balance between structure and personalization. Yes, we might give them Gibbs or Rolfe or Brookfield model or Sean, but let them personalize it. Don't see it as a rigid scaffold or structure that they have to use. You know, let it be purposeful to them. The permission to be creative, that reflection can come in all different shapes, sizes, and types. Be creative with your reflection. Again, make sure it's purposeful. the coach-mentor relationship they have with their coach throughout the program, and the importance of the coach listening for understanding. That's listening for misconceptions, listening for phrases that they use that can suggest that they might not get it at the moment. But most importantly, holding environment for the toleration of confusion, as Cousins suggest. But also us being vulnerable as educators and coaches and even supervisors in terms of our reflections, so that people can learn from them and actually say, okay, that's what it looks like to them. So these are some of the things that we're doing in our program to really support people as we see that real value in terms of reflective practice as part of the coaching and supervision and mentoring process. But hopefully some takeaways for you all, whether that be as an individual coach or supervisor or a coach educator, whatever that might be. I hope that you take something from this that you can work with. Provided the aims of the session, so hopefully people feel like that we've satisfied those in enough depth that would be expected in a 75-minute session. And finally, I've provided the references that we've used for today's session. So I'd just like to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for making me feel comfortable in terms of this environment of being my first GPS dialogue presentation. So thank you for that. You made me feel very welcome. And thank you, Nicola, for all your support.
Oh, Stephen, thank you so much. It's been a really, really brilliant session. We were talking on our, just while you're in your breakout rooms as well, about this work in this living space and looking forward, but also looking back. And I think that you've sparked so many different sparks of synapses going in everybody's heads here. So Stephen, thank you so much for leading this. And I can exclusively reveal that Stephen will also be leading a session at the Global Provider Summit itself in November. And it's so new, we haven't even advertised it yet, but make a date for, I think it's week commencing the 14th of November. So I hope to see you there as well. But Stephen, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody.